like this, man. It's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like all the time.
All right, Scott Mannion, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Dr. Burden, I'm well. How are you?
Yeah, it's a big deal, getting your medical license on the internet. It's amazing how easy it is. People go to school when you can just say that you're a doctor and no one can prove otherwise. But I'm really glad to have you on, man.
Yeah, man, it's good to be here.
Yeah, you were one of several people who, I scheduled to have on the show, and then something came up with scheduling, and you and I were sharing before when, time moves fast, and I think it's been almost a year since you were supposed to come on, but I'm really glad to have you on, man. It was highly requested by my fan base.
Yeah, I was surprised by that, but that's really cool that people are around. It's good because that helps a lot, doesn't it? Being able to get the message out there when people that watch you go say, "Hey, have this person on." So I'm very glad to.
Well, definitely. It also makes my job 100% easier, because I think this will be, close to episode 280 when it comes out. And your Rolodex fills up quickly, and there are people who are great and you want to have back on. But obviously, people come because you're talking to new and interesting people. And so having sources is incredibly helpful. But I'm curious if you could, just for my audience who may not be familiar with you, who are you and what do you do on the internet?
Okay, who am I? I'm a herald of the master, in terms of an emissary of the Lord. But where I came from was the film industry. My parents were in the film industry. I formerly worked in the film industry all my life. I was a film director and writer. I made a film called The Defector, which is a Cold War drama, which actually just sold to Sony in Asia. So that's playing on Japanese Sony cable television. And I made that with Oscar-winning cinematographer Russell Boyd. I won an Australian Directors Guild Award for that, which is a national award, a very big award for best online drama for that. I went over to LA, lived there for a little while, met up with the conservative scene. And this was when Trump was first elected. And it was so degenerate, really. You're already on your knees trying to get finance for things anyway. But the fact that you'd also have to make propaganda, and with all the politics, the world was sort of imploding, really. And being a conservative, you're already under pressure. And I noticed even the conservatives there that I hooked up with were kind of cucked, I suppose you could say the word, and all very afraid to even reveal that they were. And this was sort of the group that I sort of linked up with was connected with the Friends of Abe, which is like the group that Arnold Schwarzenegger and various people were a part of. I made friends with people like Michael Knowles, who I would say is, obviously, it's a problem that he works for the Daily Wire. Let's just say that. And what I did was, in that time that I was there, I started to want to leave that industry. And I invited, because I was connected with Paul Joseph Watson and Carl Benjamin, who you probably know. And I recruited Carl into a project trying to get to the ground of what an ethnic group is. And me being Anglo-Saxon, also Celtic, but Anglo-Saxon, that was my mission for the next few years. And so I recruited Carl Benjamin. I invited him out to the United States. I introduced him to a bunch of conservatives, Michael Knowles and various people who went on their shows during that period. I hosted some events to introduce him to the various American conservative types. And from there, I went over to England, worked a bit with Carl, getting to the ground of what this is, because we're looking for the anchor. We're looking for the anchor to anchor. And so you're deep in the ethnic layer, looking for the thing that you ground yourself in when the revolution is occurring, which is all, as we know, has been going for hundreds of years anyway, the golden calf of liberal modernity. and that's what you learn, of course, you're in reading deep into philosophy and deep into the nature of what a value is, which ends up being an entity. Fundamentally, that's what you learn from, you know, reading Dugan, deep into ethnosociology, then into esotericism in this work, realizing that to actually disclose the truth of what an ethnic people are, you have to go deeper, because you're only dealing with what has been. And then you realize you're dealing with elements of time that the traditional world picture is actually correct about, because the more we investigate into quantum mechanics, we recognize that the picture, actually the tradition better fits what the truth is about reality. You know, you have cognitive scientists now talking about hyper agents. What is a hyper agent? Of course, we've known that forever. It's a demon or an angel, higher order entities. And so you're moving from a study of what is in esotericism is called an egregore of a people, the egregore of a people, which is sort of based on war, you could call it, Heraclitan fire, and the antithesis creating what something is out of its battle with other different peoples. But deeper down, it becomes necessary to disclose the providential future of a people. And so it's deeply involved with what politics is, disclosing this vision, because all the political parties that are in power, Trump included, don't have a future. They're still operating off what has been. What you have to do to disclose this folk angel or hyper agent, you can consider that just something we all share if you want. But there is a deep truth about this. And so that's what I ended up investigating. But to do that, you actually have to initiate. To do that, you have to have a fundamental radical transformation at the ground of your being, which is, of course, what Jesus Christ is. Or else you can't communicate with what is supposed to be the vision of a people, which is your archangel or folk angel, which is, as it's known in esotericism. Again, these things are not unknown to science for the Spurg types watching. Cognitive scientists talking about hyperagents, these things are real. And the traditional world picture is actually more experienced in talking about them. And so that's who I am. And through that process I went through, that's why I was gone for a year. That's what I was doing. Deeply, deeply involved in that mystic process to do what is called initiation. And what does initiation mean? It means initi. It means going to the beginning. It doesn't mean some sort of initiation ritual. It's actually you could call it the prototype of that. It means going to the beginning as the ground of the subject, the unconscious, but also the object. And you can do that with practices that are revealed by people like the mystics, of course, St. John of the Cross, but also Rudolf Steiner and Valentin Tomberg, who everyone must read, especially people who are considering paganism, because he gives paganism as much love as can be given, but shows truly that Christ is the culmination of all the truths that were within paganism. But yeah, that's who I am. That's what I do. I talk about depth Christianity, really, the deep meaning of Christianity, but also the practices to be able to do the same thing. To what someone like Dugan talks about, this is being very long-winded, but what people like Dugan talks about, the radical subject, he's not an initiate. He's only talking about it theoretically. So were Gwenon, so was Evola. They're all talking about it theoretically. Yes, they tried to engage in practices, but they never achieved it. Valentin Tomberg did. The mystics do. Steiner did. But these people are sort of ignored in this scene. I think perhaps there's a reason behind that. Perhaps there's a devilic reason behind that. But they unite the intellect and spirit. And so Dugan, when he talks about the radical subject, that's what we have to do. But he hasn't done it. His theories are all based on what has been. Yes, he's done some great work, and these are great thinkers we can learn a lot from, the traditionalist thinkers, the perennialists, but they never achieved that initiation. But it can be achieved, and there is a way. Of course, that's the Christian life, authentically done. People like St. Seraphim Rose did it. But there's also a way which is described by people like Valentin Tomberg, Steiner, and again, the mystics. It's obviously very hard when you're reading the saints and such because they don't have the same words to describe it, but they essentially are doing the same thing as Valentin Tomberg and Steiner did. But yeah, that's it. That's what I do.
Yeah, so there are several things there, right? I think one of the big dividing lines, right, between people on the right is what is the source of their complaint with modernity, and people sort of pick different jumping off points, and there's a camp, and I'll admit I'm friends with a number of these guys, right, like Dr. Ed Dutton, who are full on empiricists, right, and they would say, well, what makes a people, right? And it's a certain number of alleles or a certain kind of combination of genetics, right? And look, there's a certain degree to which that is real. I don't want to minimize that, but there's something more that makes like a people an ethnicity, right? And you see this in a number of things, right? So for instance, right, you and I are probably genetically very, very similar, and there's a certain common cultural heritage there, but we are different ethnically, right? I've been doing a sort of an extended series on the American Scots-Irish, right, which is kind of a weird mix of Irish, Scottish, and English, right? And those are a very specific people group. They had special customs. They worshipped in a very unique way, and you can trace that group throughout the history of America, right? The history of my country. Similarly, right, when we talk about WASPs, right, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, there's a literal definition of that, which would include a great number of people, myself included, but that speaks to a specific culture, right, that is not merely genetic. And you see that in other groups as well, right? Afro-Caribbeans don't tend to get along particularly well with Black Americans, right? There's animosity there. I've seen it firsthand. And there's a degree to which that a people is sort of defined by the story they tell about themselves, right? Their narrative, the thing that kind of defines them as unique, right? So the American Southerner, right, has the story of the Civil War and Reconstruction. That is the thing that sort of defines them, right? There's a narrative, and there are smaller and larger versions of this, right? But there's a degree to which I think that narrative, in much the same way that people kind of excuse me, I bumped into my microphone. People envision themselves in a narrative context, but also people envision themselves as a narrative, right? As the players in a story, and there are obviously positive and negative versions of this. All right, so we look at our English cousins, right? You and I, and we see that their story has been very much corrupted, right? Their story has become one of an indelible original sin. Right. They have, the sin of the empire, and they must atone for that forever. Similarly in America, right. Jim Crow, slavery, that is, the indelible sin that we must atone for forever. The Germans have their own. We don't need to say it, but, the people in charge, our elites, realize the power of that cultural narrative. And so that's the reason, right, that things like, statues being taken down, like, Cook in Australia, or, any number of American figures in the US, well, that really matters, right? Because one of the kind of artificial distinctions the liberal mind makes is, the difference between politics and religion. Because they're really two sides of the same coin, because your relationship to authority is very strongly correlated with your relationship to God, right? Those things are closely related. The medieval mind would say, God, is obviously the king of kings, right? And so kings owe their fealty to him. Then, the barons owe their fealty to the king, and so on and so forth. I'm not, obviously a particularly well-versed medieval scholar, but that was a very linear relationship, right? It was a giant pyramid. And so when we look at our kind of modern, politics, really what it is it's a horribly distorted civic religion, right? We have our saints, we have our holy days. And, to look at that as exclusively a political problem, you're sort of missing the forest for the trees, right? The spiritual problem and the political problem are one and the same, right? They are both ultimately narratives, right? They are narratives of, who you owe fealty to, how a man acts correctly. I realize even the concept of a man would be, relatively, controversial in certain circles, right? But to me, that's sort of how I view it. And, when you're talking about, right, a people, an ethnos, effectively what that is from a certain perspective, right, is a story.
Yeah, I think we can, in terms of the ethnos, we can look at Steiner and we can look at Evola. Steiner draws a distinction, and he does this from essence. And people can look at this. It's, I believe, it's his lectures on the folk angels, and he talks about Germanic myth in that as well. He makes a distinction between people and race. So they're both communities. So he is very much in agreement with you. And his analysis goes beyond just academic. He is using spiritual faculties to engage in the essence of things. So that's one thing. Evola splits race into three different a metaphysical part and a genetic part. So, these people aren't empiricists, but even empiricists know that their position isn't certain because of Kant, because of quantum mechanics. The whole situation implodes of the authority towards truth that empiricism presents. And so what an idealist would say to an empiricist, or a hermeticist, a Christian hermeticist, a Christian mystic would say, which is a synthesis of both anyway, idealism and realism, would say you simply haven't waited long enough to go into the depths of experience to see the essence of things. That's why you're missing it. So that's what you'd say to an Ed Dutton. And what you're talking about there is also interesting. So what is that surface? There's also a surface element of a people and a substantial element to a people. A surface element of people is what you could call, again, the egregore. That's what happened with Mustache Man, I think, or let's call him Austrian Painter. I think that's enough code. What happened with him was he got possessed by the egregore, which is the surface demon element of what a people is. So it's not just the narrative. There's a surface narrative, which you could call propaganda to a degree, but then there's a depth. So there's a conscious layer and then there's an unconscious layer. So peoples have an archetypal layer in the unconscious that is there nevertheless, even when you propagandize over with liberal modernity. You can get to that through investigation. And of course you have to go through the initiation process like someone like Carl Jung did to disclose these different layers of what a people is. But you're quite right if you trust that distinction Steiner makes, but that there is an element of what is American, but it's not necessarily what the narrative is that they tell about themselves. That's usually what political philosophers describe as what a people is, based on what they have access to, almost in that empiricist perspective, even though they're not just talking about race and genetics. What we do need more in this political scene is an understanding of the depths, and that's quite hard because it requires a lot of sitting with things, not just releasing content that's gonna get clicks. You have to deeply investigate things. But when you do, you should notice, people will notice there's what this person's saying has a substance to it that isn't otherwise there when other people describe what an American is. It feels, there's a evaluative juice to it. And what does that also mean? There's a difference between authority and power. Like you talked about authority. What is authority? Fundamentally, is it actually comes from God. It's to be capable of, and to know. And those three things adapt to different spiritual faculties that we had before the fall. A good way of understanding this is understanding Gandalf the Grey versus Sauron. Sauron is the will to power. It's just the things that the orcs are just a raw extension of him, a machinic extension. That's how power operates. It's a compulsion. You're compelled to do something. Or in an indirect way compelled via the economy. God works differently. He works voluntarily. He doesn't compel. We see this in how Gandalf the Grey, when he resurrects as Gandalf the White, operates. People around him are naturally sense there's a truth, there's a substance to what he's saying that makes them want to be around him. That makes them, he has the good with him. That's authority. You feel encouraged because the emotive is fundamental to Christianity, but the emotive actually is deeper. Thought, propositions actually have at their ground three other elements to them: the will and feeling and thought are primordially linked together, which means you don't actually have an ideal. An ideal is actually an entity. Fundamentally, it's an archetype outside of the everyday naive view of things. That's what happens when you link them back up together. And so that's what authority has, is when someone with authority, true authority, a true king who's an initiate and is supposed to be in deep communion with God, when he speaks the truth. And it's not just the truth and this essence or divine energy, you could call it from an Orthodox perspective, uncreated. What is uncreated is with them and flows into you. And as Heidegger talks about, the way disclosure works is a mystery. Between how we understand each other is a mystery. It's not just this proposition that's thrown and then it's this isolated thing. It's actually quite a mystery how things are disclosed. And so as you initiate, as you become more authentically Christian, like the monastics, like the mystics, you gain more authority. You're capable of more things, but in a divine sense, and collaborating with the miraculous, right? And following divine will, and helping people heal by following divine will. And so those things.
Oh, sorry. Finish that thought.
I was just going to say, no, I'm basically finished. You can jump in.
Yeah. So there's several things there, right? One of the kind of the interesting kind of common lines in liberal thought. And again, when I say this, every time I've mentioned it so far, I'm not saying that in kind of a spurious sense of like AOC, right? I mean, like the Western liberal tradition is the idea that, the highest faculty of man, the thing that matters most is reason, right? Reason is kind of the king, and everything that happens is a direct result of reason, right? So like I consent to X. The things that matter most about me are the things that I consent to. Right. And you see this in the most explicit, right, in a term that gets kind of thrown around, particularly like LGBTQ circles, but like just leftist circles in general, right? Which is the idea of the chosen family, right? Which is the idea that, your parents aren't your family. It is the people you choose to associate with. Similarly, we see kind of a less offensive version of this in the way that people like, Joel Berry and a number of kind of, quote unquote Christian conservatives talk about the idea of, citizenship, right? That is something you choose. And that, if someone chooses to be an American, chooses to be an Australian, chooses to be a Brit, well, they are just as much those things as if someone was born here. And, really that kind of like hyper fixation on consent has, led to a lot of kind of like the evils of modern society. Because one, that's really not how reason works, right? There isn't this force of reason. And I realize you're Orthodox, so mentioning Augustine might trigger you, right? But nonetheless, right, he talks about, reason being the slave to the passions, right? That men's will, their reason, their soul all bear, right, the marks of sin, the marks of corruption, right? That there's something in all of those that doesn't work correctly. And so to just take reason out, to view reason as, this force of enlightenment, that if we could just do things reasonably, we will have these perfect societies is very much not the case. Far from ushering in an era of peace and prosperity, right? The 20th century and even, let's be honest, the 19th century were marked by horrific violence, right? Brought on by, at least by the standards of the time, liberal, reasonable regimes, right? You even look at, someone like Marx, and it's difficult to talk about Marx because conservatives talk about Marx in a really, really stupid way. And so you almost can't bring him up without poisoning the well, right? But he presented what he was doing as an extension of the scientific process, right? This is, a logical, reasonable conclusion. And does that mean, on the other hand, that we throw reason to the wind, right? We say, my political objective is to do stupid things that don't make sense. Not at all, right? But reason is a limited capacity. And so when we're talking about, what a people is, there are things about it that you can't touch, you can't feel, you can't prove. But if you discard them, you end up in a very monstrous place, right? I think that you see the kind of like logical extension of, kind of like reason and utilitarianism, which are not the same, but are highly linked, right? in the kind of like arguments for euthanasia, right? The arguments that it is better if we just kill old people because, you know, they live uncomfortable lives, or we can, you know, increase the economy a certain amount. And really, whether we look at the kind of like economic woes of, you know, this kind of thought process, you know, the demographic woes of, you know, being replaced in our own nations, or, you know, what you know, people in Canada have done successfully, continental Europe likewise are attempting to do in the UK, which is just killing people. It's very, very obvious that, you know, unchecked reason can lead you to just a, you know, absolutely like horrible hell on earth.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, what it sort of proves, what has occurred, is that the empirical subject can't be relied on if he hasn't purified himself. And that's fundamentally going back to what we were sort of talking about with authority, or what the old kings were sometimes involved with, which again is this initiation. What you're looking to do is not completely do away with the intellect, but to sacrifice it, to bow it, just like you bow, and to synthesize it together, really, which is what happens in initiation, which is also alchemy, which again is Christian mysticism. So you're trying to sacrifice the intellect fundamentally. You're trying to get out of that reflective mode, which actually, as we know, as you're saying as well, is a very limited faculty, and also is Luciferian. Fundamentally, that's what the intellect is. There is another mode, which is connected with understanding, which is what philosophers like Henry Bergson called intuition. This isn't women's intuition, none of that rubbish. This is a fundamental, you could call it gnosis. Again, that's a dirty word, but meaning it's fundamentally connected to uncreatedness, which is the spiritual faculty of what they call spiritual touch, actually. So it's connected, it's uncreated. Whereas the people have a problem with gnosis as a word because it's like visual visions and that sort of thing. That's not what I'm talking about. So intellect, it can't be relied on. And so what do we need to do fundamentally to escape that liberal modernity utilitarian worldview is to kind of escape that faculty, which I call the thought regime. If you defeat the thought regime, if you defeat the regular regime, you're still dominated by the thought regime. And so when we say that with Trump being elected, it's a good, nice milestone, but it's the thought regime is still in place. And these aren't really religious people. I mean, even a lot of NRX sort of tries to use Christianity as cynically. But what we want to put in charge is not the intellect. It's actually the transcendent self. What does that mean? Well, the I am. What's God fundamentally is the transcendent self of transcendent selves. Most people don't have judgment. They think they are giving consent, but really they are just a mimetic product of liberal modernity. The things you want are just provoked by commercials. So Dugan's quite right when he talks about homo provoked is all you are in liberal modernity. It's planetary idiocy. That's quite true. And again, there's a lot he's wrong about, by the way. But, you know, he's pushing Russia. That's his thing. So we need to escape that mimetic product. So what do? We're trying to get out of that thought regime paradigm that makes us just a product, that manufactures consent, or even consent is not true. We're not even really rational. We're actually mimetic products. You know, we're proddings of commercials. Like I said, proddings of inherited desire, where modern will, modern wish. What is the will? It's wish. It's fundamentally a desire that's implanted. And so what we try to do, what they used to do back in ancient times, or kings would do, an organized minority must do, which is to actually establish a relationship with this transcendent self. And what is that fundamentally? It's your guardian angel, for one. It begins as that, of course, and ends up being Christ as you purify yourself. But what is it also? It's conscience. That word, you think you understand that word. I don't mean you, Burden, but we think we understand that word. We think we understand conscience. We don't. It's an impulsion towards something or a negative, right? It's as Bergson talks about it, these are the intuitions of practical intuition, truth intuition, And moral intuition, what are they? They're nothing other really than the way, truth, and life. And then the different intuitions related to the good, the true, and the beautiful. And they're sensed emotively. Sorry, I'll just finish that little bit. And so that's what we have to do, because our judgment can't be relied on as the empirical subject. It's garbage. And you think you have judgment, you don't. You just have heredity. You just have your prejudices that you were given by the mimetic product that you are. So if we want to win, if we want to actually escape liberal modernity, we're not going to throw away the intellect. That still is a part of it, but it has to fundamentally bow. And how do you do that? Through poverty. And how's poverty done? What does that mean? The oath of poverty? It means Christian meditation. It means to bow the head for an hour a day. Can you not watch with me for an hour, as the Lord said? That's it.
Yes, there are several things here, right? So I'll recommend, there's a very good podcast between Space Age Maximalist and a good friend of mine, Stormy Waters, right? Going through consciousness. It's really fascinating. I'd highly recommend it. There are several things he talks about there, right? And Stormy's actually funded a great deal of consciousness research himself, so he knows quite a bit about it. And they mention a couple things there, right? One of the most interesting is we can do this in animals, right? We can do things to animals you wouldn't really want to do to people. But they will basically run experiments on, groups of birds, right? And they'll do things like they'll have, some professor dress up in a funny hat, bother some crows, whatever. So he comes back a week later. Of course, the crows remember him. Whatever, right? Seems pretty simple. But when this gets interesting, right, is this study was run for decades. So what he does is he's like, all right, well, I'm just going to get one of my undergrads, make him wear the hat, walk through campus and see if the birds go after him. So of course, right, makes sense. Well, one generation that crows is still there. Then it gets weird, right? Because, well, their children do it too, right? They know, go after the guy in the funny hat. Okay, whatever. Maybe they have some kind of language we don't understand. But what gets really weird is all of a sudden, if you're wearing that funny hat near a population of crows that's separated by 100 miles, well, they know too, right? How do they know? How was that information? How was that meme spread? Okay, whatever. You can say, Burden, shut up, stop talking about crows.
No. This is great. Yeah.
But there are other things, right? Like there are cases in which people have had large portions of their brain completely destroyed and are still able to, talk or speak completely normally. And then on the other end, right, you have people who are, one language speakers their entire life, get in a motorcycle accident and wake up speaking a different language. And you can look at that and say, whatever, it's random chance. It's just a sheer product of, rolling a dice a certain amount of times. That may be true. But I think it's, more interesting to look at this as if consciousness is something separate, right, from your physical body, right? They are not the same thing. And again, right, if we're talking about the kind of memeplex, right, the number of ideas people sort of uncritically assume, obviously there are a great deal of them. But I think perhaps the most damaging, right, is the idea that, the physical world is all there is, right? That the sole point of your life is to, for your short time on earth, make yourself maximally pleasurable, right? Fire off those neurons in your brain the most number of times, and that's a good life. Now, obviously, we could go back to the Greeks and say, Plato's response was, okay, then the best man on earth is a guy covered in sores who can pay a slave to scratch him, right? Unlimited desire, satisfied forever. But on another end, right, there's that idea that, if that's all there is, if the point of your life is just simple, self-aggrandizement is just kind of satisfying your urges, well, then the things that, these kind of deeper meanings, deeper narratives about a people, about a place, about, like the concept of the sacred, well, that all goes out the window. And somewhat paradoxically, right, and actually not paradoxically, right, this is something you see in scripture, right, that in the same way that you must lose your life in order to save it, right, you must sort of, in order to actually have an enjoyable life, you must inoculate yourself to kind of like suffering and discomfort. And, to me, that idea that, and obviously that's just kind of a thing, that's something humans are prone to, right, is kind of hedonism. But again, I think in kind of our modern world, it's very much tied up to the idea that, this is all there is. The only thing there is what you can touch and see. And when you're done, you just go back to sleep and your consciousness is over, right? When your brain dies, so does your consciousness. So sorry, Scott, that was a big old rant I threw back at you, but I'm curious if you have anything you want to go on.
No, that's great. I mean, fundamentally, it's like I was saying before too, is that what this is and sorry to the empiricists like Dutton, but it's the everyday naive view of the world. The only reason why the depth element of things can't be generalized like science is because only a certain amount of people can develop the faculties to go to the depths. So fundamentally, what is science? It has to be generalizably valid for everyone, always. And so that will happen at the end of time. Everyone will eventually have to do that, to go to the depths. But you can verify it for yourself by doing the practices, by going to the practices, and he will disclose himself to you. It's like Nick Land talks about. I mean, there's many wise people that recognize that these things are true. That divination is legitimate. You just have to use it with respect, because again, you're not dealing with a mechanical process. If you treat it like a mechanical process, the divine swats you away. The Lord swats you away, So you can't confirm your experiment, but you can personally. And all you ever have is a personal certainty, unless you trust a mortal authority on the matter. I don't deny the power of science, but that's all it is. Fundamentally, it's power, not truth. It's power. And again, like we've talked about, you mentioned these strange experiments. We understand that too through some of the stuff Land talked about when I had him on as for a dialogue.
Oh, see, you have talked to Nick Land. Nick Land is a huge influence on me, and I'm almost afraid to talk to him. It's
yeah.
At a certain point, it's like you've read too much of someone to have a real conversation with them anymore. But yeah, I'm curious, right? What was your?
He's a definite master. He's he's an esoteric master in the sense that you treat him with respect. And I think I gave a really long introduction, which you got to respect your thought elites, even if you don't agree with everything with them spiritually. I think that helped up the dialogue a lot. He's right about a lot of things. I mean, this is a very thoughtful person. The people that have discovered the depths recognize that there is an essence, not existence. I mean, science is the thing, the disclosure of knowing of existence, not of essence. And so and how do you do that really? By staring at being, by staring at the senses long enough. That's basically what you do until poverty reveals itself. Once you've lowered the intellect, which is fundamentally related to the Luciferian ego, once you bow that, once you dissolve it, then these things will present themselves to you miraculously. And so with hyperstition, that's really a temporal phenomena. But it's still, I mean, when we're talking about the unconscious, what do we mean? Okay, hyperstition, where is this region that it affects that we can't see? Okay, this is related to providence. I said many times in my lectures on my channel, there is a future that's available to you. What is our understanding of the future? We've got memory, that's the past. And our future, what's that? It's a goal, some goal we have in modernity, some projection. Otherwise, it's not an existential availability, is it? You can't see it, you can't access it. But what do we know about? We know about the unconscious. Jung posits a collective unconscious. This is true. There is a unconscious for the object and the subject. Now, what is that? What you don't know, that's the unknown. It's not known to you. There's an unknown, an outside, as Land talks about, fundamentally, things that are not yet known by human logos, or Luciferian logos, you could call it. It's not known. What does that mean? It will eventually be known. Okay, so what is that then? That's the future. If it's unknown, it's in becoming. It has not yet become. It's not yet with you. So it's somewhere, it's temporal, but nevertheless, like you might not, you don't know it, yet it is something you can investigate. And that's what these great philosophers do. All great philosophers are actually mystics. That's what theology fundamentally was originally. You couldn't be a theologian unless you had theology with you, unless you had access to this future, this providence. And it turns out to be it can be an available thing you can interact with by delving in through meditations, by simply attending and staring at being long enough. With prayer, of course, though. And so that's the future that Land's talking about. But in terms of segmenting these things, we live in space and time. This domain that hyperstition comes from is the domain of the will. That's time on its own. Will is fundamentally a temporal phenomena because it's the domain of action, right? So when Jung's talking about the collective unconscious, that's where that is. So there's an unconscious, you can access it. And how do you understand that? You have dreams. That is something that can be interpreted. And so that's where you interact with the future. But even deeper through the unconscious, you have outside proper, the eternal. And you can interact with that and receive messages from that. And that has been revelation since the dawn of time. Has come from that providential outside. But you can find it existentially. It can render itself as a fact of your experience if you do these practices. But if you live in the naive empiricist worldview, you'll never find it. If you, all I'm saying to empiricists is just to surrender that. Be a great philosopher and convert yourself into this, because that's what a great philosopher can do. Make a decision after. Surrender your certainty and see what happens if you go through the practices. Millions, there's so many great thinkers that have done this. Why wouldn't you? You're not a great philosopher unless you can convert yourself into another thought mode, is what I'm saying. So lower that certainty, lower that spurg mind that thinks it knows everything. And the whole E-right scene is full of that. I know better. I'm the knower. Do you? Maybe you don't know shit. And I said that to myself millions of times when I was going through this process. Surrender that. Let yourself be told by providence what the truth is. Let him approach you. And so that's fundamentally what Land is really talking about. But I think he thinks hyperstition might be a phenomena that is not just temporal, it's actually eternal. But I don't know. He's changed a bit since times. I don't want to make predictions about what he is and isn't, but I think he is moving towards a Christian perspective slowly. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, there are several things there, right? One of my biggest influences is Thomas Carlyle, right? And he has this book. It's a Victorian book, so it has an incredibly long title that I never remember correctly, right? But on heroes and hero worship, right? Where he basically goes through 8 different kind of great men. And, there are several things in there, right? Obviously, each man he goes through, he kind of chronicles their virtues and describes how they represent, a different aspect, right? And in the middle, he basically says, obviously, Christ is the ultimate hero, right? He's the ultimate figure. And these men, even if they weren't Christian themselves, reflect different aspects of that, right? But, he basically talks about, the very quotable phrase, hero worship is the essence of civilization. And what he's basically describing is, right, having a figure, right, having someone who is, larger than life, a demigod to even divine, right, who, men see as, something to be emulated, something to be striven towards. And so, right, in that narrative sense, right, they are sort of consciously molding themselves after that person, right? They are basically saying, that is the thing I wish to strive for, right? I want to become like that. And what's particularly interesting in that is he kind of does a compare and contrast between, Cromwell and Muhammad. And look, I have bones to pick with both of those men, right? That's not really the point of this, right? But he basically talks about both of those people as these kind of holy prophets, right? These men kind of possessed of the spirit of the age, who were able to kind of remake, the fabric of their society. And I think that's a really interesting idea, right? Because there is a sense to which, people become possessed by ideas, right? They become possessed by, and I'm going to say this word for the 10th time, right? Like a narrative, right? A meme, that enables them to sort of transcend, the literal description of what they are. And I think that that's really, really fascinating, right? Over the past 4 years, we saw an awful lot of, shall we say, like negative possession, right? We saw a lot of people kind of like horribly twisted and mutated by, ideological contagions, right? By memes. And as with many things, that is a feature of humanity that in and of itself has no moral context, right? Being swept up by an idea is not inherently good or bad, right? The thing that changes that gives it moral weight, right, that is the determinant factor, right? And you see this, right, in the way that kind of like 20th century liberal writers tend to write about, mass movements, right? That the psychology, if we want to use that frame, the theology, if we want to use another, of, a National Socialist and a communist were not all that different, right? They were both possessed by ideas, greater than themselves. And I think that when we talk about worship, right, whether it's hero worship or like the literal worship of Christ, right, it is effectively like slaving yourself to an idea bigger than you. And I think that if we deny that, right, if we exclusively focus on the things I consciously assent to, right, that I believe that I consent towards, you're really missing a very important part about how humans work, right? You're limiting yourself to a single square on the board, if you see what I'm getting at, Scott.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's several things here that are really interesting. There's this idea that ideology, how I mentioned that at least for the inside human logos and what we know in the everyday understanding, that ideology appears as if it's just propositional construction. But you can see in the different things that emerge that they're actually related to values, which are actually beings, which means that you can see, for instance, in liberal modernity is actually a recapitulation of the golden calf. You can see that Mustache Man was a recapitulation of Mars, you could call it. You could see in Freudianism a recapitulation of Astartes in terms of the driving factor that they attribute reality. These are all gods of existence, not essence. Of course, the god of essence is outside of time. And so you could call these gods of existence as temporal archetypes in a way. But there's like despicable ones like Quetzalcoatl, which relies on human sacrifice, but these are egregores. But then there's heroic archetypes, which you can see with the historical archetypes we see also in our religion, but also in Greek mythos, which are more like characters of the unconscious, the development of the human temporal side of the unconscious. So it's not all negative. But so there's a depth layer to ideology and ideas, right? So you've got what's that Greek Perseus. He's an antithetical hero, a hero that fights Medusa. I think it's fights Medusa, right? Is an antithesis from the thesis that exists. So that builds up metaphysics. That's also related to Greek metaphysics, right? Is the Apollinian, is that diurnal order, which is fundamentally built on this antithetical way of thinking, this combative Heraclitan. And so you can see that there's a great book that people should read, which is called The Anthropological Structures of the Imaginary. And this is what it does. It connects these modern thought regimes, these modern propositional superstructures with these depth historical archetypes, which are entities, people. You got to get into this mode of thinking. All the great people like Land understand this. These are entities that we're dealing with here. When you say value, he's identifying with these values, he's actually identifying with an entity, which we can only see so much of consciously. And so we think we know how everything's going based on the memes that we observe. But then there are things going on beneath the surface in those people. It's called the night side of history, We're only observing the day side of history. And then we attribute to that naive worldview as the cause of everything, when it's actually these things that are below the surface that are causing them. So what's the difference between what we do with Jesus and in the church? Well, they're authentic. Sometimes they're prototypical. Prototypical means outside time, typological, rather typological. And so you say Jesus is both a typological. Again, this is getting a bit Platonist. I'll be accused of that. Getting a bit typological and historical at the same time. And so what do we do? Because Carlyle's talking about, when he talks about hero worship, he's talking about what has been. We can't just be what has been. That is an important thing, a historical archetype. You also can't have that as your God either. They're still gods of existence then. You can't have a hero as your anchor. The God of essence, which means that he's not of existence. He is not. God is not, because he's outside human logos. That's what that means. Fundamentally, he's fundamentally a mystery, fundamentally always above what we can understand. But also, what do we do when we're doing remembrance? We're actually making the saints and the Lord present when we celebrate Christmas. We're not just remembering it. And so that's what the worship is fundamentally, but these things need to be canonized and connected to the outside. So what is the living tradition? Well, it's not just remembrance, it's connection with providence. It's like we were saying as well. So it's the honor your father and mother. That's what this means, to have a living spiritual stream, to have a living tradition. That's what that means. And that means remembrance. The mother is the depths of what has been, which is the eternal brought inside, you could say, in another way. And so you have to liturgically live that. But what does that do when you're celebrating all these different things on the liturgical calendar? It makes them present, brings them to presence. Providence, what is that? Well, that's divine will. By going through purification, we access something. Again, you can get locked up in hero worship and then be possessed by that. You don't want to be possessed completely, because you have a individual providential future. God cares about even the littlest things of your life, wants you to have a life full of essence, and your decisions to be made because of essence, so they can be eternal. Because only what will survive is what is of moral essence at the end of the time, not the sort of pointless exercises of utilitarianism, which will all fade away. But the littlest things will be survived at the end of time, things that have essence. But the point is, it's mother and father. Father is providence. You have a unique... Let's talk about it this way. We mentioned the unconscious before, right? There's this place that's available. If you just worship a thing of what has been, that is unknown, and that is in the unconscious, but it's not outside proper. The eternal return of the same, the eternal recurrence that Nietzsche talks about, that's true of temporality. But you also have to escape that as well. You have to have a relationship with providence. That means by going through this purification, you have to honor the mother and father. You have to... How do you do that? By making your will, using revelation, which has been revealed before, making that the content of your will. That's obedience. And once you make his will, which has been laid down in revelation, the content of your will, that takes time, that obedience. Once you do that, then that providential purpose becomes available to you. The word destiny, the Western word for destiny, means is actually our word for karma. Destiny is actually what we don't want to be, because it's just a destination based on what has been. The gods of existence operate on what has been deterministically. That can be with astrology, or that can be being like Dutton, who contributes the past. The future is just a product of the past. Anything that doesn't see the miracle as true, that determines it, okay, it's Freudianism, it's biology, you're just a product of biology. Any of the theories about this, including astrology, you're just a product of astrological influences. That's all deterministic. And so's Carlyle in a way. And so we have to also escape that to have a vision for what a people will be. I love Carlyle. I've read the same book. It's an amazing book. It's important to understand that. But also we have to get out of it, to be new, to be ingressions from outside. And what is an ingression from outside? It's a causeless thing. It doesn't have a cause. It's a miraculous ingression. Everything else has a cause. It's the final cause. So reality, fundamentally, when you look to the depths of it, is moral. There are moral, this is karma, destiny, right? Your sins in the past, or even hereditary sins, affect your future. Christ came, providence came to forgive sins and heal us, so we wouldn't be trapped by what has been, and we could move towards having access to intuition and these faculties we've been talking about, so we can do a divine will and have a cause that's from the future. And that's what we need. That's what elites need. That's what a organized minority need, because you're not going to really defeat the thought regime or the regime without that, without true authority, because it's a desperate thing. What does Gandalf say in Lord of the Rings? He says, was there ever any hope to Pippin on the wall looking at Mordor? Was there ever any hope? Gandalf. He says, no, just a fool's hope. And that's what it is, because there's no hope otherwise, unless you have connection with the future. He knows the future. He knows how the regime needs to go down or how it's defeated. He is the future. So that's the only way to defeat them, really. Even as an individual, you just need to get outside the intellect. You have to go through this process, and no one is and no one has. Like, that's from what I can tell on the right wing. But it can be done. It can be done. You just got to orbit yourself around God, not even heroes like Carlyle. Yes, that's important, but they have to be lower on the hierarchy. It has to be the God of essence. And who's that? He speaks in the language of the self, which means he doesn't speak in the language of existence. He speaks in personality, and I. He's within. He's deep within. That's how you access him, from within. Sorry, another rant there.
No, not at all. So we are fast coming up on time, Scott. If people want to find more of you and your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
If my name's showing here, you could just Google search that. But otherwise, it's you can see it on Twitter under the same name. Just search it on YouTube, or search it here, or go to scottmannion.com/fellowship, where we have a fellowship which is helping people also go through this initiation, so they can participate in it. And it's that's what the work is. But watch the lectures first. I don't hide the way from people, but if you want to do the thing collectively with other people doing the same thing, then join the fellowship at scottmannion.com/fellowship. But just watch the YouTube lectures. It's on the front page of my YouTube. Just search my name.
Well, again, I really enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate you for coming out. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can either do that directly through the links down in the description, or you can head over to our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. That's going very well. We got a lot of guys signed up, and it's a ton of fun. Highly recommend that. Again, Scott, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Doctor.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. Light can't last forever. Good night.